Now members, in the previous lesson, we have seen how do we maximize and minimize if the overall or the exact value is positive. Now in this lesson, we are going to focus what happens if the overall value is negative. Now, I'm going to start with a simple explanation here. In mathematics, always this is greater than this. What does it mean? The smaller this is, the bigger it is in terms of negatives. The bigger this is, the smaller it is if it's negative. So, in simple terms, when we have the exact value when it's negative, to maximize it, we make it smaller. In simple terms, we minimize it. To minimize it, we make it bigger. In simple terms, we maximize it. So when we understand that statement, the rest are very okay. Now, let me start with this t here. When I have this t, you start that the whole of this is negative. That's why I have this note that t is less than 0. In simple terms, this t is negative. So the overall value of this is going to be negative. In simple terms. Now we are showing that these values here are positive. Because we factorize out negative, we are showing that they are positive. So we take that should be constant. Now, to get this now, it means that now, to maximize this, I minimize this. What happens if I minimize it? Because this is negative, now I need this to be small, so that if it's small, it's going to be greater than this which is big. That's why, whenever it's negative, to maximize t, then this should be minimum. The value should be minimized. So, and you said if you are adding two things to minimize them, you add their minimum values. And if you are having now, if you want now a minimum, you maximize this. This is the idea. Because when you maximize it, the bigger it becomes, the smaller it is in terms of negative. That's why, if you want a maximum of these two, this is what's going to happen. Now, if I have a difference, what happens? As long as it's negative, maximum, I'm going to minimize this. How do we minimize this? We make this minimum and make this maximum, so that we make it more smaller even. How do if I want minimum, this is going to be maximum. How do I maximize this? X max, then it's a factor of a minimum. So, that's the overall idea. We saw this one in the previous lesson, the same idea. If you want the maximum, minimize this negative. If you want the minimum, maximize this negative, so that it's big, and in big, if you are big and you are negative, then you are smaller. Then we said how we maximize this. We make this minimum and maximize the denominator as you see there. How do we make this max? We maximize this and we minimize this as we are going to see. Now it's what we are applying here, the same case. Here we are applying the same fractions and also addition. Max, because it's negative, we minimize. If you want to minimize this, and minimize this. How do you minimize this one? Minimum, max, as simple as that. Then if you want this to maximize a negative, to minimize a negative, you maximize this. How do you maximize this? Max this plus a maximum of this. How do you maximize this fraction? Max, min. Now here, I think the care is coming when we have this. We have a negative, but this one we are subtracting. If you want the maximum, to maximize it, minimize this because it's negative. How do you minimize this? Make this minimum and subtract when this is maximum. How do you minimize this? Minimum, max. How do you maximize this? Max, minimum. As simple as that. That will be the value 4. I think now we are getting the reason why some teachers, whenever they set exact value, it's negative. They factorize out this negative. That's where the idea is coming from. To minimize this, we maximize this. I think now we are getting the reason why, because these are negatives. How do we maximize this? Make this maximum and make this minimum. How do I make this maximum? Max, min. How do I make this minimum? Min, max. As simple as that. Now this one we have a product. As long as I want the maximum, I minimize the whole of this. How do I minimize this? You minimize this and maximize this. Because this is the fraction. This is the denominator. This is the numerator, this is the denominator. How do we maximize a fraction? How do we minimize a fraction? We make this minimum and make this maximum. If you have a product that want a maximum, the same as x maximum, x min, y min. What happens is you grab the maximum, we make this maximum, you subtract the minimum of y. I think those are now the basics. We started with in the first lesson. Minimum, you maximize this. How do you maximize this? This maximum over this minimum. How do you get the product? Well, if you have the maximum, you set maximum, maximum. How do you minimize this? You make this one minimum and subtract some maximum. Now if I have a negative now here, do some extra care. Now I have a product in the denominator. As long as this is negative, this should be, its maximum should be minimized. So how do I make the same idea? Minimize this, maximize this. So when I maximize the numerator, but you see that it's a product of this and this, but we have a difference in there. So because this is the product, and I want it to be maximized, I mean minimize, this will be minimum and this will be maximum. The product, now we say if the product is maximum, you compare with the maximum, that is the maximum of this. Now this is okay, but how do we maximize this? Maximize this, minimize this. Now the basic there is how do I maximize this? Because I want a minimum, because this is negative. Max this, min this. Because it's a product, I multiply with the maximum, I minimize this and minimize this because it's a product. Now, this bracket, how do we minimize this? You make this minimum minus that maximum. Now, after understanding these basics, now let us see with examples. Now, when you know these ideas, take time and understand these things here. When you understand them, we are going to see the next example.